The waves are monsters. Each one rises like a wall of iron, smashing against the hull of the landing craft with a sound that drowns out even the scream of the artillery overhead. Inside the vessel, 32 men from the Royal Winnipeg Rifles press shoulder to shoulder, their faces green in the dim light. The smell is overwhelming. Salt water, vomit, fear. Private Robert Harrison grips his Lee Enfield so tight his knuckles have gone white. He is 19 years old. He has never fired his rifle at another human being. Around him, men pray in whispers. Some are silent. One man, a farm boy from Saskatchewan, is crying quietly, his tears mixing with the spray that crashes over the sides. The date is June 6th, 1944. The time is 7:45 in the morning. They are 500 yards from the coast of France. From a beach, the planners have given a name that sounds almost cheerful: Juno Beach. There is nothing cheerful about what waits for them there. Above the roar of the diesel engines and the crash of the waves, Harrison hears the voice of his platoon sergeant, a man named William Tchaikovsky, a veteran who spent 3 years training in England while the real war happened in Africa and Italy. 3 years of being told by British officers that Canadians were not ready, that they lacked discipline, that their equipment was second-rate. Tchaikovsky stands near the front of the craft, one hand on the ramp that will drop any second now. His face is calm, almost bored. He has to shout to be heard over the chaos. His words will stay with Harrison for the rest of his life. "Boys, the Brits said we would not make it off the beach. They said our gear was rubbish. They said we were too green, too soft, too polite to do what needs doing today. So when that ramp drops, I want you to remember something. We are not here to prove them right. We are here to prove them wrong. Now fix bayonets." The sound of 32 bayonets locking into place is like a single metallic breath. Then the ramp crashes down. The world explodes into noise and light and death. 3 months earlier, Harrison had been standing in a different kind of formation. It was March 19th, 1944. The location was a muddy training ground in southern England. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division had been drilling for this moment for years. Years of practice landings, years of marching, years of waiting while other men fought and died. That morning, a group of British officers from the 21st Army Group had come to observe. They stood on a raised platform, watching the Canadians rehearse their beach assault tactics. Harrison remembers seeing them. Their crisp uniforms, their polished boots. The way they spoke to each other behind their hands, as if sharing a private joke. One of them, a colonel whose name Harrison never learned, had walked past a group of Canadian soldiers. They were checking their equipment, making sure every strap was tight, every magazine was full. The colonel had stopped. He looked at their gear with something like pity in his eyes. Then he spoke to his companion, loud enough for the Canadians to hear. "Poor bastards. Look at their kit. Half of it is American cast-offs. The other half is pre-war rubbish. And they expect these colonials to take a defended beach. They will be cut to pieces before they reach the seawall, if they reach the seawall." The other officer had laughed. Actually laughed. Then they moved on, leaving behind a silence that burned hotter than anger. Because the colonel was not entirely wrong. The Canadians were equipped with a mixture of gear from 3 different armies: British Lee Enfield rifles, American Sherman tanks, Canadian-made universal carriers that broke down more often than they ran. But there was something the colonel did not understand, something no amount of polished boots and perfect uniforms could teach. The men of the 3rd Canadian Division were not fighting for glory or empire. They were fighting because they had watched the world burn for 5 years while they trained. They were fighting because every day they spent in England was another day. Their country was at war without them. They were fighting because they had something to prove, and on June 6th, they would get their chance. The planning for D-Day had begun more than a year before. The operation was called Overlord. It was the largest amphibious invasion in human history. 5 beaches, 150,000 men, the future of Europe balanced on a single day. The British would take Gold and Sword beaches, the Americans would take Utah and Omaha, and the Canadians would take Juno. But Juno was not just another beach. It was 10 kilometers of fortified coastline. The Germans had spent 4 years turning it into a killing ground. Concrete bunkers with interlocking fields of fire, machine gun nests hidden in the dunes, artillery positions zeroed in on every meter of sand, and below the waterline thousands of obstacles, steel hedgehogs, wooden stakes, mines attached to iron rails, waiting to rip the bottom out of any landing craft that came too close. The plan called for the Canadians to land at 7:35 in the morning, low tide, when the obstacles would be visible, when the engineers could blow paths through them, but the weather had other ideas. On June 5th, a storm hammered the English Channel. Waves rose to 6 feet. Wind howled at 30 miles per hour. General Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, faced an impossible choice: delay the invasion and risk losing the element of surprise, or go ahead and risk losing everything to the weather. He chose to go, but the storm delayed everything. The Canadians would not land at 7:35, they would land at 7:45, 10 minutes late. 10 minutes that would change everything, because by 7:45 the tide would be coming in. The obstacles would be underwater, hidden, waiting. On the night of June 5th, Harrison lay in his bunk aboard the transport ship. Around him, 300 men tried to sleep. Most could not. Some wrote letters they hoped would never be sent. Some played cards. Some simply stared at the ceiling, listening to the creak of the hull and the endless pounding of the waves. Harrison thought about the colonel, the one who had laughed at their gear. He wondered if that man was somewhere on this same sea tonight. If he was lying awake, wondering if the Canadians would even make it to the beach. He wondered if the colonel had any idea what these men were capable of. The answer was no. The colonel had no idea. Neither did the Germans waiting on Juno Beach. Neither did the world. But they were about to find out. At 0400 hours, the naval bombardment began. For 2 hours, battleships and cruisers pounded the French coast with shells the size of small cars. The sound was like the end of the world. From the transport ships, the Canadians watched the horizon light up with orange fire. They watched the smoke rise in black columns. They told themselves that nothing could survive that bombardment, that the Germans would be dead or broken by the time they reached the shore. They were wrong. The naval bombardment missed most of the German positions. The fortified bunkers were too well hidden, too well built. When the shelling stopped and the smoke cleared, the machine guns were still there. The artillery was still there. The Germans were still there, and they were ready. At 0600 hours, the order came. Load the landing craft. The men filed down cargo nets that hung from the sides of the transport ships. The sea was still rough. The nets swung wildly. Some men fell, most held on. They dropped into the landing craft one by one, weighted down with 60 pounds of equipment, rifles, ammunition, grenades, rations, medical kits. Everything they would need to fight their way off a beach and into France. The craft pulled away from the transport ships and formed up in long lines. Behind them, the sun was starting to rise. Ahead of them, the coast of France was a dark smudge on the horizon. And all around them, thousands of ships, the largest armada ever assembled. Battleships, destroyers, transports, landing craft of every size and shape, all headed in the same direction. All carrying men who knew that many of them would not see the sunset. Harrison sat in his landing craft and tried not to think, tried not to imagine what waited on that beach, tried not to wonder if the colonel had been right, if they really were too green, too soft, too poorly equipped to do this. Then he looked around at the men beside him. Men he had trained with for 3 years, men who had become his brothers. and he knew that whatever happened, they would not break. They would not run. They would prove everyone wrong. The landing craft pitched and rolled in the heavy seas. Water poured over the sides. Men bailed with their helmets. Some were seasick. Most were simply terrified. But no one spoke. There was nothing to say. They all knew what was coming. At 7:30, the first wave of Canadian landing craft hit the beach at Courseulles-sur-Mer. The ramps dropped. The men charged forward into water that was waist-deep. And the Germans opened fire. Machine guns, mortars, artillery. The water turned red. Men fell. Some disappeared beneath the waves, dragged down by their equipment. Others made it to the sand and dove for cover behind the bodies of their friends. The beach was chaos. The naval bombardment had done almost nothing. The German defenses were intact, and the obstacles, God, the obstacles. Because they were 10 minutes late, the tide had come in. The steel hedgehogs and wooden stakes were underwater now, invisible. The landing craft hit them at full speed. Some craft exploded when they struck mines. Others were ripped open, spilling men into the sea. Out of the first wave, 30% of the landing craft were destroyed before they even reached the beach. But the Canadians kept coming. Wave after wave, craft after craft. They hit the beach under fire and they did not stop. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles, the Regina Rifle Regiment, the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada, the North Shore Regiment, the Canadian Scottish Regiment. They came ashore under the worst conditions of any Allied force that day, and they did not break. Harrison's craft was in the second wave. By the time his ramp dropped at 7:45, the beach was already littered with the dead and wounded. The sound was indescribable. Explosions, gunfire, men screaming, the hiss of bullets cutting through the air, the wet thud of rounds hitting flesh. He charged down the ramp into water that came up to his chest. The weight of his equipment tried to drag him down. He fought his way forward, his eyes fixed on the seawall 200 yards ahead. A man beside him went down, then another. Harrison did not stop, could not stop. If he stopped, he died. So he kept moving, one step, then another. The water grew shallower. He was on the sand now. Bullets kicked up fountains of grit all around him. He ran, zigzagging, diving, crawling, anything to keep moving forward, anything to reach that seawall. Sergeant Tchaikovsky was ahead of him. The man moved like he was on a training exercise, calm, controlled. He reached the seawall first and took cover behind a concrete pylon. Then he started waving men forward, directing them, organizing them, turning chaos into something that looked almost like a plan. Harrison threw himself down beside the sergeant. His lungs burned, his hands shook. All around him, men were taking cover wherever they could find it, behind wrecked landing craft, behind chunks of concrete, behind the bodies of the dead. The Germans were still firing from their bunkers, long bursts of machine gun fire that swept the beach like a scythe. Tchaikovsky grabbed Harrison by the shoulder and shouted in his ear, "We cannot stay here. We stay here and we die. You see that bunker? The one with the gun port? We need to take it. Gather 10 men. We go in 3 minutes." Harrison nodded. He could not speak. His mouth was too dry. He crawled along the seawall, tapping men on the shoulder. 10 men, that was all they needed. 10 men to assault a fortified bunker that had already killed dozens. It should have been suicide, but it was not, because the Canadians had trained for this. 3 years of rehearsals, 3 years of learning how to move under fire, how to work together, how to kill. 3 minutes later, Tchaikovsky gave the signal. They went over the seawall in a rush. 5 men laid down covering fire. The other 5 sprinted forward, zigzagging toward the bunker. Halfway there, Harrison saw the muzzle flash from the bunker's gun port. He dove left. The bullets missed him by inches. He got up and kept running. They reached the bunker from the side where the machine gun could not reach them. Tchaikovsky pulled the pin on a grenade and tossed it through the gun port in one smooth motion. The explosion was muffled by the thick concrete walls. Then silence. Tchaikovsky kicked in the steel door and went inside, his Sten gun ready. Harrison followed. Inside, 4 German soldiers lay dead or dying. The grenade had done its work. One of them was still conscious. He looked up at Tchaikovsky with eyes that were wide with shock and pain. He could not have been older than 20. Tchaikovsky knelt beside him and checked his wounds. Then he looked at Harrison. "Get the medic. This one might make it if we patch him up." Harrison stared. They were supposed to kill Germans, not save them, but Tchaikovsky's face was set, so Harrison ran back to the beach and found the medic. A corporal named Martin, who was already working on 3 wounded Canadians. Martin did not hesitate. He grabbed his kit and followed Harrison back to the bunker. He worked on the German soldier with the same care he had given to his own men, because that was what Canadians did. By 0900 hours, the Canadians had cleared the beach defenses at Courseulles. The cost had been terrible. Dozens dead, dozens more wounded. But they had done it. They had taken the beach. Now came the hard part, moving inland. Because taking the beach was only the beginning. The real objective was miles away, the town of Caen. If they could take Caen, they could open the door to the rest of France. The Canadian armor began rolling off the beach. Sherman tanks, universal carriers, self-propelled artillery. The tanks had been waterproofed for the landing, canvas skirts and sealed hatches. Some of them had worked, others had drowned in the surf. But enough made it through. And now they were pushing inland, grinding up the narrow roads that led away from the coast. Harrison's platoon moved with them. They advanced through fields that had been mined, through hedgerows that hid German snipers, through small villages where the French came out to cheer and cry and press bottles of wine into their hands. The Canadians could not stop to celebrate. They had orders. Keep moving. Push as far as you can before the Germans can organize a counterattack. By noon, they had advanced 5 miles inland, farther than any other Allied unit that day, farther than the British on Gold Beach, farther than the Americans on Omaha, who were still pinned down by German fire. The 3rd Canadian Division was leading the entire invasion, and they were doing it with the gear the British officers had laughed at. But the cost kept rising. Every mile brought new casualties. A sniper round from a church steeple, a mine hidden in a roadside ditch, a German 88mm gun that appeared from nowhere and knocked out a Sherman before disappearing again. The Canadians learned to move fast, to keep their heads down, to trust the men beside them. At 1500 hours, Harrison's platoon reached a small village called Colombey-sur-Théon. It was supposed to be undefended. Intelligence said the Germans had pulled back to regroup. Intelligence was wrong. As the lead section entered the village square, a machine gun opened up from a 2nd-story window. 3 men went down in the first burst. The platoon scattered, taking cover behind a stone wall. Tchaikovsky swore under his breath. Then he pointed at Harrison and 2 other men. "You 3, work your way round to the left. Get into the building next door. We will keep them busy." They moved fast, staying low, using every bit of cover they could find. They reached the building and kicked in the door. Inside, the house was empty, furniture covered in dust, a photograph on the wall showing a family that was long gone. They moved up the stairs, their boots silent on the wooden steps. The machine gun was still firing. They could hear it through the wall, one long burst after another. Tchaikovsky and the others were returning fire, but the German position was too strong. Harrison reached the top of the stairs and found a door that connected to the next building. He tried the handle. Locked. He stepped back and kicked it. The wood splintered. He kicked again and it flew open. The German machine gun crew never saw them coming. There were 3 of them, 1 on the gun, 2 feeding ammunition. They were focused on the street below. Harrison brought up his rifle. For a moment, he hesitated. These men had their backs to him. It felt wrong, like murder. Then he thought of the 3 Canadians lying in the street. He thought of the colonel who said they would be cut to pieces. He pulled the trigger. The battle for Colombey-sur-Thaon lasted 20 minutes. When it was over, the Germans were dead or captured. The Canadians had lost 5 men killed and 8 wounded. It was a small action, the kind that would never make it into the history books. But it was happening all across the Canadian front that day. Small actions, small victories, each one bought with blood. By 1700 hours, the 3rd Canadian Division had pushed 9 miles inland. They had linked up with British forces from Juno Beach. They had secured a beachhead that was 6 miles wide and deeper than any other Allied penetration. They had done what everyone said was impossible, and they had done it with equipment the British officers had mocked. But the human cost was staggering. By the end of June 6th, 340 Canadians were dead. 574 were wounded. Entire sections had been wiped out. Entire platoons. The beaches were covered with the wreckage of landing craft and the bodies of the fallen. The fields inland were littered with burning tanks and discarded equipment. That night, Harrison sat in a ditch beside a darkened road. His platoon had been ordered to dig in and hold their position. Around him, exhausted men scraped shallow trenches in the hard Norman soil. No one spoke. They were too tired, too shocked by what they had seen and done. Tchaikovsky sat down beside Harrison and offered him a cigarette. Harrison did not smoke, but he took it anyway. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the glow of fires on the horizon. Finally, Tchaikovsky spoke. "You did good today, kid. We all did. I know it does not feel like it right now. I know all you can see are the men we lost. But we did something today that no one thought we could do. We proved them all wrong." Harrison nodded. He was too tired to feel pride, too numb to feel anything. But somewhere in the back of his mind, he thought about the colonel. The one who had laughed at their gear, who had said they would be cut to pieces. He wondered if that man knew what the Canadians had accomplished today. He wondered if it would change anything. Probably not. The world had a way of forgetting the things that did not fit its expectations, but Harrison would remember. Every man in the 3rd Canadian Division would remember. They would remember the beach, the obstacles, the machine guns, the mines, the cost. And they would remember that when everyone said they could not do it, they did it anyway. The days that followed were a blur of combat. The Canadians pushed deeper into France. They fought through hedgerows and villages. They faced German counterattacks with names like Panzerlehr and 12th SS Panzer Division. Young fanatics from the Hitler Youth who fought with a savagery that shocked even hardened veterans. The casualties mounted, but the Canadians held their ground, and slowly, mile by mile, they pushed forward. By June 12th, the 3rd Canadian Division had linked up with the British Second Army and formed a continuous front line. The beachhead was secure. The invasion had succeeded. But the battle for Normandy was far from over. It would take 3 more months of brutal fighting before the Allies broke out of Normandy and began the liberation of Europe. Harrison fought through all of it. He saw friends die. He killed men whose faces he would never forget. He learned that war was not glorious or heroic. It was mud and blood and exhaustion. It was doing terrible things because the alternative was worse. It was surviving another day and wondering why you lived when better men died. But he also learned something else. He learned that when everything is against you, when everyone says you cannot do something, when your equipment is second-rate and your training is mocked and your chances are slim, you can still win. Because winning is not about having the best gear or the most experience. It is about having the will to keep moving forward when every instinct tells you to stop. It is about trusting the men beside you. It is about proving the doubters wrong. On August 21st, 1944, Harrison stood on a hill overlooking the Falaise Pocket. Below him, the remnants of 2 German armies were trapped, surrounded, destroyed. The Battle of Normandy was over. The Canadians had been in the thick of it from the first day to the last. They had paid a terrible price. Over 18,000 casualties, 5,000 dead, but they had done their part. More than their part. That evening, Harrison saw a group of British officers visiting the Canadian positions. They were touring the battlefield, inspecting the wreckage. One of them was a colonel. Harrison did not recognize him at first. Then the man turned and Harrison saw his face. It was him, the one who had laughed at their gear 3 months before. The colonel was not laughing now. He walked through the Canadian lines with something like respect in his eyes. He stopped to speak with a group of soldiers from the Royal Winnipeg Rifles. He asked them about the fighting, about the landing, about what it had been like on Juno Beach. The men told him. They told him about the obstacles, the machine guns, the mines, the men they had lost. And the colonel listened, really listened. When they finished, he stood in silence for a long moment. Then he spoke. "I was wrong about you. We were all wrong. I want you to know that. You are as fine a group of soldiers as I have ever seen. I'm sorry I doubted you. It was not much, just a few words. But it was something." Harrison watched the colonel walk away and felt a knot in his chest loosen just a little. Because the apology did not matter. The recognition did not matter. What mattered was that they had done it. They had taken the beach. They had pushed deeper than anyone else. They had fought and bled and won, and no one could ever take that away from them. The war went on. Harrison fought through Belgium and Holland. He was there when the Canadians liberated the Netherlands. He saw Dutch families weeping with joy. He saw children who had been starving for months, stuffing themselves with Canadian rations. He saw women kissing soldiers and old men shaking their hands with tears streaming down their faces. He saw what liberation looked like, and he understood finally why it had all been worth it. On May 8th, 1945, the war in Europe ended. Harrison was in northern Germany when he heard the news. He sat down in the ruins of a bombed-out building and cried. Not from joy, not from relief, but from exhaustion, from the weight of everything he had seen and done, from the knowledge that he had survived when so many had not. He returned to Canada in the autumn of 1945. He took a train across the country to his home in Manitoba. His family met him at the station. They hugged him and cried and told him how proud they were. But Harrison could see it in their eyes. They did not understand. They could not understand. No one who had not been there could understand what it had been like, what it had cost. He tried to go back to normal life. He got a job, he got married, he had children. But the war never left him. He dreamed about Juno Beach, about the sound of bullets hitting water, about Sergeant Tchaikovsky waving men forward, about the German soldier bleeding out in the bunker, about all the small moments that had felt so huge at the time but that no one remembered now. The years passed. The world moved on. D-Day became history, then legend. Hollywood made movies about it. But the movies were always about the Americans, about Omaha Beach, about the Rangers and the paratroopers. The Canadian contribution was a footnote, a sentence or two in the history books. Harrison watched the movies and felt the old anger rise up in his chest, but he said nothing. What was the point? In June of 1994, Harrison returned to Normandy for the 50th anniversary of D-Day. He was 70 years old. His hands shook, his back hurt. But when he stood on Juno Beach and looked out at the water, he was 19 again. He could see the landing craft, hear the machine guns, smell the smoke and blood. He walked along the sand and remembered where his friend Tommy had fallen, where Tchaikovsky had taken cover, where he had thought he was going to die. A young French woman approached him. She had a child with her. A little girl who could not have been more than 5. The woman spoke in accented English. "Are you one of the liberators, one of the Canadians?" Harrison nodded. The woman took his hand and kissed it. Tears ran down her face. "Thank you. Thank you for what you did. My grandmother was here that day. She saw you come ashore. She told me that before you came, she thought the war would never end. But then she saw the Canadians, and she knew. She knew we would be free. Thank you." The little girl stepped forward and handed Harrison a flower, a small white rose. He took it with hands that trembled. He tried to speak but could not find the words. The woman understood. She squeezed his hand and walked away, leaving him alone with his memories. Harrison stood on that beach for a long time. He thought about the colonel who had laughed at their gear. He thought about the men who had said the Canadians were not ready. He thought about all the doubt and skepticism they had faced. And then he thought about what they had done despite it all. They had taken the beach. They had pushed deeper than anyone else. They had fought with courage and skill and determination. They had liberated a continent. And they had done it with equipment the British officers had mocked, with training that had been dismissed, with odds that everyone said were impossible. They had proven the doubters wrong, every single one of them. And that, Harrison thought as he turned away from the sea, was worth more than all the medals and recognition in the world. Because they knew what they had done. They knew who they were. They were the men who took Juno Beach, and no one could ever take that away from them. Today, there is a memorial on Juno Beach. It stands on the sand where the Canadians came ashore on June 6, 1944. The names of the fallen are carved into stone. 340 names, 340 stories, 340 reasons why the world is free today. Tourists visit the memorial every year. They take photographs, they read the names, but most of them do not know the whole story. They do not know about the obstacles, the delayed landing, the rough seas, the British officers who said it could not be done. They do not know that the Canadians advanced deeper than any other force that day, that they did the impossible with equipment everyone said was not good enough. But the Canadians know, the survivors know, and now you know. This is their story. This is the story of the men who were told they would fail and chose to succeed anyway. The men who took the beach. The men who proved everyone wrong. The men who showed the world that courage and determination are worth more than the finest equipment or the most prestigious reputation. Remember their names. Remember what they did. Because this kind of story does not get told often enough. The story of the underdog who wins. The story of the man everyone doubted who proves them all wrong. The story of Juno Beach. The British officers laughed at their gear. Then the Canadians took the beach and changed the world.